I'd like to say good morning again, and then I'd also let you know that the topic this morning is money, 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 buying a democracy. And it has been said, and a quote, that when money talks, democracy walks. And so we're going to ask, those questions and see the perspectives of our panelists today. I also said I think that I should frame our discussion today, number one, with what does the First Amendment say of the United States Constitution, and then what is the League's position, the National League's position on, campaign financing. And so, I left my glasses at home. And so, the First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. The League of Women Voters of the United States presents its public policy position on campaign financing as being to improve methods of financing political campaigns in order to ensure the public's right to know, combat corruption and undue influence, enable candidates to compete more equitably for public office, and to promote citizen participation in the political process. And so we will frame that discussion in the light of, number one, the First Amendment, and number two, in the League's position on campaign financing. There were a couple of interesting facts I also wanted to share, because I kind of did a skim of a book, and I was talking to Mark Johnson, and he says he has about 10 books going at a time, and I have, less than 10 books, but I'm always very interested in books, and so I did, in preparation for this particular program, look at a book called When Money Talks, and there were two interesting facts. Actually, there are many more, but you don't want to listen to them. But the two interesting facts that I found is that they said that only about 25% of the American populace gives money in a campaign to any one candidate. And they say that the contributions are about $25, sometimes $50, but mainly around the $25 mark. The second interesting fact was that the 38 top big donors gave on an average of $9.9 million. So when we look at the little contributions, and they did speak of the election of 2012. I don't know, I'm going back a century here. 2012, the little people, so to speak, collectively raised over $313 million. But the 38 fat cats topped that by almost double. So that is extremely interesting, and it will help the discussion as well. And so who is going to help us with this discussion? Number one, leading off will be attorney Mark Johnson. And a little bit about him is that he is an adjunct professor at KU in the School of Journalism, and if that weren't not enough, also in the School of Law. He is also a law partner and a founder of Dentons Law Firm, a multinational, the largest, and he said, I said, is it in the state or where? He said, in the nation, the largest multinational law firm in the nation. And so that's a pretty good, I'd say, credential there. I also try to humanize the people that come. So I asked them, stump the panelists questions. And so this morning's Stump the Panelist question, you've heard this question before. It was asked of one of the presidential candidates, who is a world leader that you admire? And I wanted to see how fast. Come on, let's get it. And so Mr. Johnson's candidate or person that he admires is the President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos. And it was for bringing peace between the warring factions in Colombia. Our next speaker will be Ms. Joan Wagnon, and she is a trailblazer. Looking over her very stellar career, she was the first woman mayor in Topeka. She's been a state legislator, secretary of the Department of Revenue, former chair of the Kansas Democratic Party, currently the treasurer, and she has also been given lots of credit with making some major changes in the YMCA. So her Stump the Candidate question, I believe in being equitable. So I asked her, and she said that her candidate or person that she admires is the chancellor of, no, she didn't say that. That was mine. President, because they asked me, what's yours? Okay, was President Obama, and she admires him because of his ability to see and seek middle ground and to compromise. Her favorite pastime when she's not, doing all the many things she's involved is bluegrass. And Mr. Johnson's favorite pastime, I forgot to say, is that reading 10 books at a time. Our third panelist is Clay Barker. He has a very stellar career, very distinguished, graduate from West Point, an officer in the infantry. 2011 became the executive director of the Kansas Republican Party. And his national leader, he said, is Bob Dole, and that he continues to talk to him about once or twice every month. And he admires him because he's still influential on the national stage. His activity that he enjoys, pastime, is he is writing a book, and he was going to use it as a fundraiser. However, I want you to know it's already 1,000 or 2,000 pages. He's going to have to kind of narrow it down. A truck will have to bring it in. And it's on the political process, political history. So these three persons, I wanted to humanize them. I think you found some interesting facts to chat with them about, but they really are here to talk about money and its influence in politics. We'll start off with Mark Johnson, who will frame our discussion with the First Amendment. Mr. Johnson.
Good morning. Is this on? How's that? Oh, thank you. Good morning, everybody. And to follow, and Ann, thank you for that kind introduction, and to sort of illustrate my interest in books, one of my favorite cartoons was a New Yorker cartoon, probably ran about 10 years ago, and you have a prisoner sitting on a bunk in a small prison cell, and the door is obviously just swung shut. He's sitting there with a glum expression on his face, and over his head are the words, "Damn, I forgot to bring a book." That's how I feel about it. Ann, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Let me begin by saying that money in politics is nothing new at all. As long ago as 1907, Congress passed a law called the Tillman Act that is still in effect today, and it prohibits corporations from making political contributions. So if you think a corporation actually makes contributions to campaigns, they don't. It's against the law. And the other side of the coin was realized in 1943 when Congress made it illegal for labor unions to make contributions to political campaigns. That's still the law today. You might have figured out that they have figured out ways to deal with those limitations. The most comprehensive campaign finance law that we deal with today on the federal level, in other words, for campaigns for president, U.S. Senate, and the U.S. House of Representatives, was passed in 1971. It's been amended a number of times, but it's been in effect for about 45 years or so. And so all of the controversy that you hear about federal campaign finance arises out of that law. The courts, as you might guess, are the arbiters of the issues of dispute in federal campaign finance. And so there are a number of influential cases, mostly decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, that I'll tell you just very little bit about. In 1976, the court decided a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. Incredibly long decision. It's well over 200 pages. I don't recommend it to anybody. But in that case, the court looked at all of the issues that are still in controversy today. How much money can people contribute to campaigns? How much money can campaigns spend? What kind of information do campaigns have to record and disclose? So the issues that we're talking about today were taken up 40 years ago by the Supreme Court. And what we learned from that case is something that the Supreme Court and all the other courts have had to deal with since then. And that's this little problem with something called the First Amendment. As Ann indicated, the First Amendment is perhaps the most important thing that has to be taken into consideration in all of these campaign finance issues. And here's why. The courts have said that expression of support for candidates includes a lot of things. It includes wearing political buttons, bumper stickers, yard signs, going door to door on behalf of a candidate, but it also includes making contributions. So one way that many people express their support for a candidate is giving money to their campaign, or giving money to these entities that we've come to know as SuperPACs. And I'll talk about that briefly as well. What the courts have said is that it's okay, it's legal, it doesn't violate the First Amendment, in other words, to limit the amount of money that individuals can contribute directly to campaigns. So that's why when you hear about somebody contributing $5 million to a candidate or $10 million to a candidate, they're not actually contributing to the campaign. They're contributing to one of these super PACs that is supporting that candidate. We as individuals are limited in the amount of money that we can give to campaigns. Through inflation, it's risen to $5,400 for every 2 years, $2,700 per election. So if you wanted to support a candidate in a primary, you could give $2,700 to that race, and then you could give another $2,700 for the general election. That's the maximum amount you can contribute to a federal candidate every 2 years for their elections. The campaigns then have to decide how they want to spend the money. And one of the things that the courts have dealt with were attempts, when this 1970 law was originally passed, to limit the amount of money that could be spent in campaigns. And just as the court said that the First Amendment is to be considered in how much money you as individuals can give to a campaign, they said that the First Amendment has to be considered in determining how much campaigns can spend. Because, frankly, what is a campaign? It's simply communication. The candidate trying to persuade you to vote for him against the other guy, and the courts have said that any kind of limitation on that is a limitation on the candidate's First Amendment rights, and that's unconstitutional. So that's why we have unlimited spending in federal campaigns now. You can't limit the amount of money that campaigns spend. You can limit how they raise the money, but you can't limit how much they actually spend. And then there are obviously disclosure requirements. That's why they have to file these reports we hear about every 3 months or so during a campaign. You know, how much is a campaign raised? How much is a campaign spent? We see all those news stories. That's simply because the law requires that they disclose that information. Let me talk briefly about some of the controversial issues that we're dealing with today. Everybody knows about Citizens United. There are misconceptions of what that case was about. That was decided by the Supreme Court in January of 2010. And you'll remember a few weeks after that decision came out, President Obama, in giving the State of the Union address, looked at the members of the Supreme Court sitting in front of him and essentially criticized them for their decision. And that's when Justice Alito mouthed the words, "You're wrong." The truly controversial point in Citizens United has to do with the definition of corruption. because the courts have said that to the extent the federal laws try to deal with corruption, it's okay to limit how much money people can give. Corruption for you and me can mean a lot of things, but for the law, it simply means quid pro quo corruption. You make a political contribution with the understanding that that candidate, if he or she wins the election, is going to vote your way on things. It doesn't include, for legal purposes, the type of corruption that perhaps you and I might see in access. You give money to a political candidate, the understanding there being when you call them or when someone calls on your behalf, the candidate will take the call. The candidate will return the call and wouldn't do so unless you had made that contribution. So access to an office holder is something that the court has said does not constitute corruption. That's the big thing that Citizens United was about. It also said that it's okay for corporations to engage in spending money on advocating for or against identified candidates. That was something new. But the really big development wasn't with Citizens United, it was with the case decided a couple of months later called speechnow.org. And if you want me to spell that for you, come talk to me afterwards. That's the case that created SuperPACs. That's the case in which the court said that it is okay, it doesn't violate the federal campaign laws, for someone to make an unlimited contribution to an entity other than the campaign, to a committee, it's called an independent expenditure only committee. That's the formal name of it. Unfortunately, a newspaper person who wrote about the case soon thereafter coined the word super PAC for that. Super PACs and traditional PACs, traditional political action committees, are entirely different creatures. But so in 2010, this phenomenon of the super PAC was created, and that's where the big problem is today. That's where the dark money is. Those are the entities that get the $1 million contributions and then spend the money on behalf or against a candidate, advocating for or against a candidate. Let me tell you when you can determine who's paying for a TV ad or a radio ad you see or hear. If you don't hear the words, I'm so-and-so, I'm the candidate and I approve this message, then you can assume it's a super PAC ad, or it's an ad not sponsored by the candidate himself or herself. Only when you see or hear those magic words, you know it's something that the candidate himself or herself is behind. I'm trying to stay on time. On the state side in Kansas, we've had a comprehensive campaign finance law since 1981, and there really isn't much controversy about it. You can make relatively, at least in my opinion, modest contributions to political candidates in Kansas. The most you can contribute to a political candidate is to someone running in a statewide race, and that's $2,000 per election. Corporations and labor unions can make political contributions to candidates for state office in Kansas. But again, the amounts are relatively modest, and so, at least in my experience, you don't see candidates, in essence, being bought by these contributions. I don't know that there's any big controversy right now with the Kansas campaign finance law. I'm sure if Joan and Clay believe there is, they'll let you know. But here's the bottom line. As of today, there are no limits on the amount of money someone can contribute to a super PAC. There's no limit on the amount of money that super PACs can spend for or against a candidate. There are no limits on the amount of money a campaign can spend, and there are no restrictions on the messages that campaigns can distribute during the course of a campaign. In other words, negative advertising is here for good. It works. Candidates like it. Campaign managers love negative advertising because it's extremely effective. Now I'm going to turn it over to who won the coin flip. Is it going to be Joan or Clay? Okay, I'll turn it over to Joan, and I'm sure she'll give you the Democratic view of things.
That little button's hard to push. Thank you all for being here this morning. This is a topic I love to talk about. When I first ran for office, it was 1982, and the campaign finance law in Kansas had just passed. And I thought, who better for my campaign treasurer than the guy who was working in legislative research who actually drafted the law, because I was very concerned about staying within all of that. We'd gone through Watergate in the 70s, which gave us PACs, which the point was that small donors would be able to pool their contributions and therefore have a greater impact. So campaigning that I experienced as a state legislator was relatively simple. You got on a good pair of shoes and you walked door to door and you handed out a little card that says, "This is how wonderful I am," and you asked people if they would vote for you. And you spent your time hopefully talking about things that were important to your district. I always felt like many times I'd run for social worker for door to door, because that was how I found out what was happening in my legislative district, and that's how I found out what I needed to be working on to meet the concerns of people in my district. Then a little later, I ran statewide and discovered that the nature of campaigning for a statewide office is quite a bit different. And then at some point, after I left the legislature and left the revenue department, I went to work for an organization called FedTax, which was promoting legislation that would allow states to require online sellers to collect the state sales tax. And with my background in tax and having been the revenue secretary, I thought it would be really important to get $263 million into the state coffers so that we don't have to keep raising the sales tax. So for 4 years, I went back and forth, not as a registered lobbyist, but as a company representative, talking to people in Congress about what it would take to get them to change the law. The Supreme Court had laid out very clearly, if you want to collect this tax, this is what you need to do. And I discovered what it was to run into the influence of big money on one side or the other. And it's really about access, but just because you can get in the door doesn't mean that you can get your bills to come up. And we were working with some fairly big companies. There was one senator from Arkansas who had just been elected, who, when I first walked in the door, was adamantly opposed to this legislation that would allow states to collect sales tax on online sales. And after Walmart called him, he was suddenly the chief champion for all of this. And I began to see at the congressional level what's going on. Unfortunately, we never got the bill passed, but I got an interesting dose of money and influence. I think it's fair to say that in Kansas, at least during the times that I served, and in local government in general, we have a pretty clean system in Kansas. There's not a lot of corruption. People are pretty honest about what they're doing. And the difficulties that we have, whether you are on the side of the current administration or not, come from people voting what they have are closely held beliefs about what's the right thing to do. It's not that kind of influence. So what does it take for a candidate to campaign? You've got to raise money, and you have to do it all the time. I did a little quick calculation, and if you are running for Congress, you are going, and say you run a campaign that's between $2 and $5 million, using the figure of 4 million, which is pretty normal what it would take to get a congressperson elected in Kansas, you're going to have to wake up every morning and raise $5,500. That's 2 maxed out contributions. That's 760 days, every day, $5,500. And that's a lot of money. So if you think that donors don't have access and maybe influence, I've got another thing for you. The amount of money that it takes to run these campaigns is one of the insidious influences that we have. So where are they spending this money? What is it that a candidate needs? In a state ledge race, good shoes, a campaign card, a few mailings, and those races, some of them in Johnson County, go for $100,000. But in a small rural community, you'd be hard-pressed to spend $30,000. So we're not talking about huge amounts of money. But when you get into running statewide or running for Congress, that's where the big money comes in. And there's less control, and by control, I mean fewer limits on you at the federal level than there are at the state level. So I would be advocating for that to change. The other thing, and Clay, you may want to disagree with me on this, might make an interesting conversation, but I think the role of political parties has changed substantially in terms of recruiting candidates and how we work with candidates. And I think the weakening of political parties, and I'm not speaking just about Democrats or Republicans, has also given rise to, or been the result of, I don't know which it is, of more entrepreneurial candidates who are not really beholden to the party in any way. They get out and they raise their own money, they do their own thing, and political parties don't provide in the way that they used to years ago the same level of support. And that they haven't been doing that for a number of years. And I also think the changes that we've made in the voting laws, particularly in Kansas, have made campaigning a little more difficult. You're campaigning longer because of advanced voting, which I think is a good thing. You know, it gets more people to vote, but it changes the amount of money that you have to spend. And the third-party expenditures are the independent expenditures that SuperPACs make, even though I think the decision was that because they're third party, they are not corruptible, so therefore they can spend unlimited, something like that. If they can raise unlimited, yeah. But that is a significant difference, and one that I think is problematic. So what improves the system? I've talked to you about some of the things that I think are wrong with the current system and what happens when we campaign. I would love to see us be able to shorten campaigns. Every time I say anything about that, I think about the campaigns in Britain. They are 8 weeks. You know, in 8 weeks you could get your message out. When I ran the first time, I didn't know any better, but the candidate I ran against had dropped off the ballot, or the candidate that had filed dropped off the ballot, and the candidate that I ran against was my neighbor in the next block. My kid was spending the night at his house the night that I decided that I would run. So it was a pretty friendly kind of thing. But nonetheless, that happened at Labor Day. And I managed to put a campaign together between Labor Day and the first Tuesday in November and win. So I know we can do it. But now we have candidates starting months ahead of that. And state campaigns go on almost nonstop from one year to the next. And if you're running for president, you're always running. And it wears out the public. It embitters the public with the amount of advertising that they see and the negativity. It does work, but it turns people off, and I think it suppresses voter turnout. So it puts the role of political parties back to getting people to go and vote. And as the chair of the Democrat Party, That's what I was there to do, get people to go and vote. And that meant I had to raise money to put a ground game in place so that we could go out and get people to the vote, to the polls. I was on a program at the Dole Center as a post-election wrap-up, and Kelly Arnold, who was my counterpart at that time, and I were talking about what happened in the last 2 weeks of the gubernatorial race with Paul Davis and Governor Brownback. And I'm not sure if it was so much, I'm not sure why the Republicans did it, but they sent $1 million into Kansas that last couple of weeks. I was just boasting with pride that the Democrats had sent me $50,000. And the difference between the amount of money that they had, and they beat us. The Republicans beat us in that race on the ground game at the end. Was it because of money? Was it because they were better organized? You can draw your own conclusion. But that $1 million versus my $50,000, and we had raised money for it, and I'm sure the Republicans had as well. But that makes a difference in the race. So that's a lot of where you have to put in money and why political parties are important. So shortening campaigns would help. I think greater disclosure would be good for the system. But if you want to know the plain, unvarnished truth, voters don't care where the money came from. I mean, you can run all these articles you want to about how much money the Koch spent or any of that, and I don't think it influences very many votes. But it's important to know where that money came from, and the disclosure rules, the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, and the IRS could do more to promote, and Congress, better disclosure in these SuperPACs. If you're hiding under the guise of a 501c4 and contributions, you don't know where the money's coming from. And I have to tell you that the Democrats and the Republicans are using all those laws to their advantage. So there's no advantage one party to the other. It's just that now that the rules have changed, everybody's learning how to do it. I also think that a total limit on campaign spending, which is constitutional, right? No, not constitutional. Okay.
You had a 50-50 shot.
But a total limit on campaign spending would be helpful, but isn't constitutional. But I think limits, lower limits, not raising the limits too much. They're pretty low in Kansas right now. Those lower limits are good, and it forces you to go out and get small donors. So there are a number of ideas that are floating around, some of which I think the League supports, which is matching funds for small donors so that you have some public funding of campaigns. I know that there's 3 acts in Congress right now that are not likely to pass anytime in the near future to change those contribution limits. I'm not sure whether Citizens United is the biggest problem that we've got. I would like to see it reversed. But I think the larger problem is public apathy and inability to get people to see investment in political campaigns by small donors is the best thing that we can do to ensure democracy. So on that, I'm going to stop because I think you're going to be asking questions later on. Right?
Thanks, Joan. And I agree with a lot of what she said, probably most of it. And just in case you guys are looking for a fight, the parties tend to have the same view of the system, even though they work for different issues, possibly, or candidates. And just a little bit of disclosure, Mark and I actually worked in the same law firm, though he left right before I came in.
But I worked with your wife.
But my wife spanned both of us. So and we have a breakfast every, once a month or so. And just so you all know, the morning am I pronouncing this right, the Obergefell decision came down? Obergefell, the gay marriage from the Supreme Court. We had breakfast together. We ended breakfast. We both look at our iPhones and go, ooh, got to get to work. So.
Really quick on campaign finance reform, I have a few bullets that I will go over and we'll open it up to questions. I think a lot of what has been enacted by the courts and the legislatures is a perfect example of where you have good intentions, but the results haven't been very good. And I believe that there's two, I think of these as axioms of the process. One is that the total amount of money that's going to come into any election isn't going to change no matter what the regulations are, because the money will find a way to get in. And a lot of campaign finance scholars call that hydraulics of money. It's like water flowing downhill. It will get around any dam or any blockage you put in there. And the problem we've created currently with our system, and this is it's not quite a quote, but it's a operative in Colorado told some newspapers, he says, "I wish the candidates would just stay home. We control their message." And he was speaking as part of a PAC and a C4 because they had so much more money than the candidates. And I've seen it in Kansas sometimes, not very often, where a candidate's running on a particular message and some group trying to help them does something in a different direction. And the people may think, well, the candidate said that. And the candidate's going, no, I didn't say that. That's this other group that's trying to help me. But we can't coordinate, so they didn't know that. And this is my fourth election cycle that I've been doing the money. And since I'm an attorney, I end up getting down to the details of all this. And it's what I spend most of my time doing in the election season, is trying to make sure all our reports are correct. I answer questions for candidates. People don't want to break the rules, although they can get very complicated, especially at the federal level. What's the money used for? Everything that you see. Mailers, those annoying postcards, TV and radio, if your campaign's big enough, social media buys, reimbursement of candidates for mileage if they drive around, especially out west. Bigger campaigns will have phone banks or walkers where they either pay interns to walk, or sometimes you'll hire a company that'll come in with 30 walkers. And this happened in 2014 for Pat Roberts' campaign. And we have to teach them how to pronounce words like Olathe and Overland Park, and they go out and walk. And they're good at it. They know what to say at the door. They don't. To them, it's just a job, so they don't get too emotionally involved. But they're very efficient. They know how to record everything. Volunteers are better because they're excited, but they're unpredictable. Kids got a soccer game, they don't show up, or Yoder's serving pizza this morning. We're going to go work over there. You can't always count on them. And unfortunately, and I know on the Republican side, we get really annoyed with this. There's these groups we call scam PACs. There are the groups in Washington that are always sending out the email blast. Obama and Boehner are getting together, and we have to stop them and send money in. And you see pictures of their offices, and there's a wine cellar and a hot tub. And you think these poor people that are sending their money to these groups because they think the parties have betrayed them. The parties are kind of housed in dingy shopping malls, or it's not really nice because we're not that wealthy. But these groups sometimes just it's almost fraud, in my opinion. Though they do spend a little bit of money on politics. Now, there's an old joke in politics, and it goes something like: it takes two things to win a campaign: money and all that other stuff. And it's cynicism, and I think in Kansas that's not true. And it's because we have small districts. Like Joan was saying, you can walk a district in Kansas, a House or Senate district. Think of California has 80 House districts, huge state. Kansas has 125. So ours are walkable. I think that's a great crown jewel of our system, that a candidate can actually get out there and walk to every house they need to. It takes a lot of work. You get a suntan, lose weight, get exercise, but you can do it. And even a Senate district, you can do it. It's a little bigger. So money is not essential. It helps, but it's not the key that'll win or lose these smaller campaigns. And I hope we keep that in Kansas. Where does the money come from? In my opinion, most donors, some are the inspired philosophical donors, but they may give the $25, $30. There's a few wealthy people that give just on beliefs. But most donors have an interest in what government's doing, that they get some benefit from it. And I'll just give you one example, and I'm not picking on these guys. Think of road builders. Their only client is government. So they're going to try to invest in or support legislators or electeds that will keep the money flowing to roads. And that's contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, their lawyers, their insurance agents. And they'll all give $50, $100, but that's because they have an interest in keeping some policy going. And I look down sometimes the contribution list and see the occupation and employer, and you can kind of tell which groups in society want more money, or the money flowing, or the money continuing to flow, and they will give a lot. And it's not that they're buying anybody, but they're trying to find legislators that line up with their beliefs. And that's just our system. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the way it works. And a great book I read that kind of opened my eyes to that was Robert Caro, who wrote the LBJ series. He wrote one on Robert Moses in New York called The Power Broker, which explains how this guy, unelected official, was so powerful in building bridges and roads in New York City that they squeezed the money out of things like education and subways and housing. There's only so much money government can spend. Okay, regulation. At the federal level, it's very burdensome, very complex. Words like you cannot coordinate with another campaign will take, say, 6 pages to explain what that is, because every time someone tries to find a way around it, they come up with a new regulation to try to block it. Kansas kind of takes the other view. We have very little regulation. We'll just say you can't do X, but what X is may be a little bit vague, and you have to get opinions and try to figure out what it is. One of the reasons I think campaign finance reform is ineffective, there's this old line I use sometimes, though the governor's staff told me not to say it publicly, but I will anyway. The campaign finance can be like a spider's web. It catches the flies, but the rats burrow right on through. The people who know the system, know the rules, are not doing anything illegal, know how to avoid the regulations. And sometimes I think regulations are almost like putting a door in the middle of a field, and you walk up to the door and it says, don't go through here, and you go, okay, and you just walk around it. And you can see it over time that money used to flow to political parties, and then as reforms came along, you might recognize some of these names, they started going to 527s, and then PACs, and SuperPACs, and 501c4s, and all these organizations, if you're in the business, you know how much they can take, what they have to report, what they can do with the money. You know, some organizations can say vote for X, others just do issue ads where they'll list 2 candidates and what their beliefs are on issues, but they don't use those magic words like vote for, and so they don't have to report who their donors are. And you, for instance, in this first district congressional race, this primary with Roger Marshall and Tim Huelskamp, after it was over, one of the vendors was trying to sell their services to me. He said, oh yeah, we got hired by some guys in D.C., we formed a PAC and a 501c4 as a pair because those groups can coordinate with each other and they can't coordinate with the campaign. And he said, we spent $5 million out there trying to get low propensity voters, people that usually don't vote, to come out and vote. And he's showing me all the social media tricks they were doing and the walkers they hired. And that's a lot of money. And there were other groups like that doing that also out there. And that's money you'll never know who contributed because they weren't necessarily saying vote for Roger Marshall. They did a data analysis, and they knew who his voters were, so all they did was try to get them to come out and vote, knowing if this guy shows up at the poll, we're pretty sure we know who he'll vote for. And that's how one way that you can get around the reporting. Now, the parties, there's 2 sort of powerhouse lawyers in D.C., Ben Ginsberg, the Republican, Mark Elias, the Democrat. They actually work together on some of these reforms because they're trying to tilt the battlefield a little more to parties and candidates, because the candidates don't like having to be beholden to these outside groups that they may not agree with. I think a lot of media coverage is lacking because this is a very technical field. They don't quite understand it. I made up this joke a long time ago. The best journalists in America are sports journalists because Americans know their sports. You can't confuse a strike in baseball with a strike in bowling, or the people will call you out. But in campaign finance, there's all these terms and words and entities, and nobody really understands it, and the journalists kind of get it, and sometimes I try to correct them. Like Susan Wagle, the Senate president, likes to talk about her Senate PAC, and I always will email her group and say, it's not a PAC, it's a party committee. And then they just think I'm a lawyer being, persnickety and don't really care. But just some thoughts on the process. I read this one line a professor wrote that we should stop trying to create dams and create canals, meaning if the money's going to come in the system anyway, try to figure out a way that it goes through organizations that are transparent so people can see where the money's coming from and actually have some support in the community. That's why I like political parties. I wrote a little article for the KU Journal of Law and Public Policy on that a little while back. But parties, they're elected by voters like precinct leaders on up, but they have grassroots and they don't stand for one particular issue. A lot of these other groups are very narrow. They can be one issue or a small basket of issues. You don't always know who's funding them or who controls them, and they're not really beholden to the public. So I think if you're trying to tilt the system so the money goes one way or another. It's better to go to candidates and parties than to all these other groups. So I don't know what we can do to unring the bell on that. And in Kansas, again, I agree with Joan. I think the contribution limits are fine. They might go up a little bit because campaigning has become more expensive, and those limits were set a long time ago. PACs in Kansas, they can take unlimited money, they can spend unlimited money, but they have to report so you can see where the money's coming from. Although sometimes there'll be a shell game. The donor gives to PAC 1, that gives to PAC 2, which gives to PAC 3, who spends the money. You don't always know who the original donor is, and the original donor may not actually know what their money ended up being spent on. And to me, the biggest problem right now is the rise of these 501c4s. They're the ones that just do issue ads. But those issue ads are so close to an election ad, you can't really tell the difference. They come from out of state, they spend huge amounts of money, but you never know how much, because when they file with the IRS, which can be often a year after the election, they just report the total amount they spent, the total amount they brought in, and a little bit of accounting. So you don't even know how much they may have spent in Kansas versus some other state. And my last thought on some of the reforms is, and maybe I'm a little cynical, but I think incumbents will favor reforms that help incumbents. So when you say things like, well, we should shorten the campaign season, which I would love and make my life easier, or reduce the amount of spending, the incumbent's the one that benefits from that, because by being in office, just doing their job, they have to show up and give speeches and go to parades. And that, okay, it's not campaigning, but it is campaigning in a way. You're getting your face out there. So you're kind of hurting that challenger, the startup candidate that maybe is the beginner at this. It's really trying to get out there and probably needs more financial investment to get a toehold. So I don't have an easy answer to any of this, although I get back to that original line I had that candidates just stay home because we control their message. That we cannot let that happen to our system. I mean, it's got to be the candidates out there taking their message to the voters and the voters deciding on that. And I'd be interested in anyone's ideas about how to reduce the amount of influence these other groups have in the process.
Okay. One of the things I know, I don't want to disappoint them. I let them know. I said the League of Women Voters are very informed voters, and they're definitely not shy. And so I know that you may have questions for these panelists, and be certain that it's a question so that more people can get their question. And since I have the mic, I'll ask the question. My question is, when all this money is raised and the campaign, is over, where does this money go? What do they do with all the money that they've raised, these super PACs? What do they use it for? Buy a boat? Buy a house?
Those are party issues.
Go first.
Well, the money generally just gets carried over. It just sits in your bank account. You have to, you're a PAC or a campaign, you report it, but you build up your war chest, is the word that gets used, and you can use it in the next election. It kind of gives you a head start if you're a candidate. If they terminate their campaign in Kansas, I mean, they shut it down, shut the bank account down, they can give it to a charity, back to donors, or to a party.
Back to donors? They've ever done that?
Yes, and this is some of the gamesmanship that happens. Say you were running for state senate, and you got $100,000 in your campaign, you shut it down, but now you want to run for some other office, you give it back to your donors, hoping they'll then turn right back and give it right back to you for your new campaign, because you can't transfer from like a House campaign to a Senate campaign.
And those are new rules because those changes were made after 2000, I think, to keep incumbents from having an unfair advantage. Was your question really, what do they spend it on?
No, it was after the campaign is over and they have this big pile of money. What do they do with it?
Well, most of them don't have a big pile of money unless they are incumbents and have been there a long time and are raising more than they actually need. Or we've got a number of candidates running for state senate now that have been there a while and they have a war chest built up, and so they don't need to raise a lot. So Clay's right.
On the super PAC side, for the most part, they raise money from individuals for specific purposes. For example, in 2014 in Kansas, we really saw super PACs for the first time in the Senate election between when Senator Roberts was running for re-election against Greg Orman. There were many super PACs involved in that. They raised money for the specific purpose of either defeating Senator Roberts or getting him reelected. And so the donors don't want to see the super PACs have money at the end of the campaign. So most super PACs exhaust the money that they have by the end of the campaign, and then if they decide they want to continue in existence, they start raising money again. So you generally don't see the super PACs have a lot of money on hand at the end of a campaign.
All right, that's my question. Okay, other questions? Hands up, and I'll come and bring the mic to you. Questions?
My name's Chris Roselle, and I'm a member of the League. My question is there no way to level the playing field? In Canada, for instance, elections are funded by the government. In the United States, our system allows a multi-trillion-dollar budget to be bought for a few $billion. I say bought, but paid, the elections to be paid for with a few $1 billion. Is there no way we can take our tax money and just pay for the elections?
Sure. If you could persuade Congress, the answer could possibly be yes. And the only example I can give you of public financed elections on the federal level in the United States is the Presidential Campaign Fund, which is a voluntary, both terms of voluntary of contribution and the use of the money. You know, there's the checkoff on your federal tax forms to make contributions into that fund. But that doesn't mean that the candidates necessarily take the money. It's up to the candidate to decide whether to take the public financing or not. In 2008, Senator McCain took the public money, but that meant that he couldn't raise any more money, and it also meant that he was limited in the amount of money he could spend. On the other hand, now President Obama chose not to take the money, and we know what a fundraising machine he turned out to be, raising more than $1 billion, I believe, in both of his campaigns. And the reason this is okay under the First Amendment is that it's a voluntary waiver of their First Amendment rights. They voluntarily decide to take the money in return for voluntarily agreeing to limit the amount of money that they spend in their campaigns. But the real reason we don't have public financing of campaigns is the incumbents don't want it.
And I just was going to share with you a comment from Robert Reich, who wrote a big thing on money and politics. And what Reich was saying is that unless there is a social movement powerful enough to influence Congress or the Supreme Court to change the rules, powerful as Brown v. Board was, to get in and cause the whole civil rights movement, he doesn't see Congress as moving on any of this. So there are 3 bills that are currently in Congress that would promote providing matching funds for small donor contributions, say $3 in public dollars for every dollar from a small dollar coming from the checkoff on the income tax return. So that's Reich's proposal, and I think the League supports something similar, and there are any number of proposals, but you're absolutely right. The incumbents don't want that, and it isn't going to pass Congress.
And on the state level, I've thought about public funding, if that's a way to do it. One of the thresholds to make sure you only get good people running is if they can actually get their family, friends, and coworkers to contribute money to them. If they won't do it, the person's got a problem. Arizona tried public funding. I don't remember the exact details, but the problem they had was, in primaries, the turnout's kind of low, and both parties probably have an issue with, and this word gets overused, like extremists running, that pound the table and scream at all the right issues. That those kind of people started winning too many races, too many primaries, because once they got in, they got money from the public, even though they really couldn't raise it from people they knew eyeball to eyeball, and they would start winning the races, and the parties really didn't like the candidates they ended up with. So maybe maybe public funding would work. There's some threshold, like you have to raise so much money first. It's easy to sign a petition, but if you can actually show you have support, then maybe the public can back it up.
I'm very interested in shortening the election time. I think we're all sick to death of the one going on right now. Would it take an act of Congress to do that, or agreement between the parties, and what would it take?
Well, I'm not sure legally what it would take. I think there may be some constitutional issues with that would prevent that. But certainly, if the parties got together and said, this is what we're going to do, and came up with something, I mean, Clay and I might sit down and say, let's not spend our precious resources chasing each other for 9 months. Let's do it for 3 months. We could perhaps tell our candidates to do that, but they are, if you'll recall, I said they're pretty entrepreneurial. They're not beholden to the party. We choose who we want to target to support with additional resources because we think they have a chance of winning. But there's a whole bunch of loose cannons out there. I don't know about yours.
Yeah, we've got them too. I understand the idea, and I like it. I just don't know how to get to that goal, because individuals they don't even have to say I'm running for office. They can just start showing up everywhere, and in a way they're campaigning. And you can't stop somebody from saying I want to run for office and get out there. And parties, there's kind of a line between how far a state or federal government can go in regulating what a political party does. It's a private organization that has its own rules, but it's part of the public process, so there is some grounds for that. I just don't know how we get there.
Under the First Amendment, the type of speech, the type of expression that gets absolutely the most protection is called political speech. So anything having to do with the political campaign falls within that definition. And the courts have found under very few circumstances can political speech be limited. I think the First Amendment would be a huge hurdle in trying to limit the length of campaigns. And it's hard for me to see Congress or the courts coming up with a way to deal with the First Amendment problem.
Candy held up the brochures or the flyers for our Meet Your Candidate events. And out of, what do we have, 27 candidates responding that they'll be there, there were 3 incumbents. So are they going where they're receiving financial support instead of to a nonpartisan, community-based event? Or how do you see the role of money and where candidates go to campaign?
Well, I think that's exactly what it is. They go where they think they could get votes. But if somebody gave me money, and the union, if unions were always a supporter of mine, if the union has a forum and they want me to come and speak to their members, you better know I'm going to show up. But basically, I think candidates go where they think they can get votes.
I think candidates, their time is their limited resource. And so they'll go, I always advise them, think what you're doing, and it either is there to persuade voters to vote for you or get them to turn out and vote for you. So they're chasing votes when they go to forums and meetings or door knocking. Fundraising can be done, by mail, direct calls to people at night. A lot of candidates really hate fundraising. It's a part of the business. They just don't like asking for money. I remember in 2010, I guess, we almost had to lock Derek Schmidt in a room to make him call people for money. He's gotten better at it now, but they don't like doing it. They like to talk to voters. They like to listen to them. They like policy, and they really hate the fundraising part, though they know, especially at the higher levels, how important it is. But invitations for little fundraising barbecues, they'll do those kind of things. But I think with forums, it's more of a judgment call on the candidate's part. It's just a good investment of my time.
Okay, another question.
Oh,
I just want to follow up on a point that Clay made, and that has to do with the candidate's time. That, at least in my experience as an observer of dozens of campaigns, is something that a lot of people lose sight of. The most important asset in a political campaign is the candidate's time. When you get close to an election, 2-3 months out, start looking, particularly on the national level, start looking at where the candidates themselves go. Not where the advertising is happening, but where the candidates go. That's where the campaigns have decided they want to focus their resources. So in the presidential campaign, I teach my election law class at the law school in the fall, and when we have a presidential campaign, as we do right now, at the start of each week, I have one student report on where Trump has been, and one student report on where Secretary Clinton has been in the previous week, because that tells us, a real astute observer, where the campaigns are really focused.
with regard to the 1040 checkoff, how much money does it collect there over 4 years between elections? And if it's not used, is it accumulating? And how much is there?
It's a lot, and that's only an estimate. If somebody wants to talk, I can look it up.
I have dark money numbers.
Tell us those.
In the wake of the first court decision in 2007, organizations that do not disclose their donors spent more than $70 million. Now, prior to that, it was zero. In 2012, after Citizens United, they spent more than $300 million. And already undisclosed spending in the 2016 cycle is outpacing all prior elections. So it's mushrooming. I don't know what the checkoff gives.
Okay, I'd like to go back as a follow-up to Melissa's question, and it's truly as the league leadership looks at how to expend our time. Are we wasting our time with these meet and greets because the incumbents are not coming? What we're trying to do is to get every candidate out. We're wanting to go to the big school districts and to present the candidates as a nonpartisan body to the populace so that they could see them side by side. But when they don't accept our invitation, then they only see one side. So what should we do? Because we're not making big donations. We're trying only to educate the voters.
I can give you my viewpoint as a candidate, having accepted and turned down lots of organizations' invitations. And Clay's right, time is where it all goes. If you want to see how those incumbents are doing, invite them to your meetings to come and give a speech when they're not in a cattle call with 27 other candidates and they have maybe 1 minute to try to say something pertinent that would persuade somebody. But give them a decent forum so they can come and make a pitch to you on this is my idea, this is what I think, this is what I've done, and do it throughout the year before you get to September, before the November election. Because in that September, October time period, it's too short. And if it's Johnson County particularly, where you have more candidates than anybody, you're sharing the stage with too many people. And it's not a meaningful opportunity to interact. Now, you also make the mistake if you do it during prime campaign time. So don't invite them between 5 and 8 or dark in the evenings when they're campaigning, or Saturday mornings when they're out knocking on doors. So that's my advice.
And part of it may be that the group is like the League of Women Voters is too successful. The candidate will come in here and think these are well-informed voters and they're going to vote. So they've probably already made up their minds, or at least they know which way they're leaning. So the candidate will think, I probably can't persuade anyone in the crowd, and they're all going to vote anyway. So I'm not here to pump them up. And they'll try. We spend a lot of time on voter turnout, finding those people that will probably vote for you, but they're on the edge of whether they'll actually turn out and vote. And that's where you'll focus a lot of your effort. Like when they do the door walking, there's all sorts of data goes into that. Which door should you be hitting with which message? So maybe if there's a way you could bring in more, I don't want to call them normal people, but people that are less informed of the process.
Okay, I know that the president had something you wanted to respond, right? Just a moment. And I also wanted to say that our meet and greets, and she may tell you how they're set up, because there is an opportunity.
We used to do candidate forums that were televised, and we found a problem with getting both candidates to show up, one-on-one. What was that? I mean, we had a hard time, and that's why we had to go to meet and greets, because we were finding that we weren't able to get both sides, and we do want to have both sides. What's your thinking about why that went away?
Yeah, there were let's talk issues, and oftentimes we'd have a candidate we'd have from each district, and there'd be the two major parties, and we'd ask them. Sometimes only one side would show up, and that's never good for a nonpartisan organization, because we want both to show up.
Well, the only thought I'd have about that is that you would probably have the challenger show up, and the incumbent decide, is this worth my time? I think it's an incumbent issue. Yeah. Why give the challenger an opportunity to make me look foolish?
Well, in our meet and greets, we do give them the 1 minute, but then the rest of the time they're at a table, and voters can go up and truly interact individually with them, with one person not even hearing what the promise is of this party or the promise of that. It's the voter going, I'll go here to this table, and I'll go to this table for the person who is running for the same office. And so we're attempting to give the opportunity for them to sell themselves.
How many different House districts are represented in this audience right now?
Yeah. All right, I have no idea.
And I can't
Probably,
count fast enough to
representative.
figure out how many people are here, but whatever your estimate is, divided by 18. And what is the likelihood that if I represent one of these districts, I'm going to find more than 3 or 4 of my constituents here? And if I have to be here an hour, I can knock 30 doors in an hour. It's numbers.
Okay, numbers. With ours, it is not just the league people. We are trying to educate the entire Shawnee Mission School District, the entire Olathe.
I'm not trying to put down your opportunities, and what you're doing is exactly right. I'm just trying to help you understand from a candidate's point of view, it's all about time. And so if I can go to a neighborhood meeting in my district that is all voters in my district, you betcha I'll get there. If I go to something that's citywide and there are only likely to be a few of my constituents, I can do more good knocking on doors.
I was just going to say that the league
doesn't just educate the members. We also educate the entire Johnson County community. So for incumbents to think that the people who go to these forums are just league members, that's not right. That's not correct, because we do invite the entire Johnson County community to come to all these forums. And that's one of our goals, is to educate everyone.
If you can promise a candidate sufficient numbers and press, those are the two things that are going to make a difference. Voters in my district and press that will get that out. I think we're all in agreement. That's the critical ingredient.
I understand time, and we've had, I think 9 representatives of the press, that have been at our events at each one, and we're just amazed, and then it looks like one side, and we don't want to look like that we're only supporting one side, because we're a nonpartisan organization. Okay, another question over here. I'll come around. I'm sorry. I'll stop here on the way.
And my question would really be, how do we give individually, what kind of chances do we have to make a difference?
I think individually, Lee, you are very powerful. And you are even more powerful if you exercise that individual contact with people during the year and not just in the campaign season. I teach a lot of advocacy classes for the YWCA, and I tell people, it's important that you get active during a campaign, but it's really important you get active while they're in the legislative session, and you go down and talk to them, whether it's Congress or whether it's a state Senate race or a state agency, that you stay in touch with them. But that's the time that you are most powerful, when you have always been there. I can remember a woman who gave me $35. She was a Republican, and I'm a Democrat. And she lived in my neighborhood. And she showed up all the time. This was back when Mike Hayden was Speaker of the House, and we were trying to pass the transportation plan. And I ended up being one of 5 Democrats to vote for Mike Hayden's tax increase, because she had been in my office week after week after week telling me about highway problems and what was going on. And I thought, I can't face her. and I voted for her.
Yeah, I'd say that as an individual, money is not the way to get influence, because candidates get money from all over the place. People like to accuse the Republican Party. Someone accused us of being owned by Koch. So I went through and I looked, and they gave us 0.04% of the money we took in 2014. It's percentage-wise, it's so small nobody really controls what you do. But like Joan said, if you volunteer for a campaign, or if you go talk to your legislator, and they're human beings. I've gained immense respect for elected officials of all parties, because what they go through while they're up there, all the opinions and the attacks. They have good days and bad days. They don't like having their motivations and their intentions impugned, or their family background, or if you just talk to them logically and present your point, most of them, the good ones, will listen to you and take that into account, because they'll start to understand that especially the new people that are going to be in the legislature this year, just like in the past, will start to understand these issues are much more complex and multi-layered than they thought when they have their little, campaign slogans, and they'll take that input and value it. Now, they don't value getting 10,000 emails that are all verbatim because people are just pushing buttons, but they'll value the individual one that's thought out. And especially if you just talk to them and show up in the office and you're not hostile, and they're not hiding under their desk trying to avoid you, because you're rational and logical. That's how you really make an impact in our system. And again, our districts are small, so these guys don't have hundreds of thousands of voters. It's a small enough group of voters that individuals can actually make a difference by visiting and talking.
Let me follow up with one idea. And Clay's absolutely right about dealing with state legislators that way on a one-to-one basis. You can actually deal with your congressperson or your senator on that kind of basis. They all have district offices here. get to know somebody in that office. Molly Hass runs Congressman Yoder's office here. Chad Tenpenny runs Senator Roberts' office here. They're both good people. They're reasonable. If you walk in and introduce yourself and say, I want to talk to you about this, this issue, believe me, that information will get communicated to Congressman Yoder and Senator Roberts. It may take a little while. There may be some filtering. But if you express yourself reasonably and you don't come across as a nut, which many people in office have to deal with, you will be heard.
Yeah, I have a question about money in a national way. Right now in this national election that we have, which is really a weird one, as we all know, there's great concern about influence from around the world, overseas, particularly from the Russians right now. What are the laws against money coming in from outside the United States? Is it a problem now? I try to follow this in the media, and as a reader of 3 newspapers, I do a pretty good job. But even the media seems to be kind of murky on this. So is there money coming in? Can money come in from overseas? And what is that situation right now?
Well, the legal answer is no. Only U.S. citizens are allowed to contribute to federal campaigns. Is it same for Kansas as well? Okay. So you will not have money coming into the United States from people who aren't American citizens, nor will you have people who are resident in the United States who are not U.S. citizens making contributions. It's simply against the law, and that prohibition has recently been upheld in the federal courts. Where I think the concern is with large corporations who do business around the world and have huge profits around the world and have executives who are American citizens who individually and through their company's political action committee make contributions. The source, if you trace it all the way back to where their compensation comes from, you could say is generated from outside the United States. But as long as the contribution comes from an American citizen, it's entirely legal.
Okay, I'm going to, before I turn it over to the president, never give a person a mic, I did forget to give a couple of pieces of information that are important. We were supposed to have Micah Kubik here, and he had a death in his family, his father-in-law. We have sent our condolences. I encourage, if you know him as an individual, please also send your individual condolences. Secondly, I do agree that if you're persistent and somewhat of a pest, that you can get results. I have worn that hat pretty proudly in my past and probably will continue in my future. In order to get Ms. Wagnon here, there's a young woman by the name of Heather who works in the Democratic office, and I called Heather almost daily, and poor little thing, she was going to be here. She was going to be here today, and she was involved in a wreck that totaled her car, and she sent that to me, but she was unharmed. So, because she said, I just want to come and meet you, I think it's like, I think she thought I was a nut. However, and those that know me may still vote in that direction. However, one of the things is that I did get a phone call from Ms. Wagnon, and I said, you're back from Europe. She said, no, I was told to call you. I'm in Berlin. And so she called from Berlin. So I wanted to make certain that you knew those kinds of things. Also, that when we make promises, we attempt to keep them. You asked questions last time of the judges, and the answers to those questions, they were put and affixed with your newsletter. So we try to follow through and also harass, whether they're judges or whomever, to get the answers to the questions that you put forward. And now, our president.